The auctioneer's hammer hung suspended in the dusty air, hesitating for just a moment longer than usual. Going once for $1. His voice cracked slightly as he looked out over the sparse crowd gathered at the Millfield County Livestock auction. In the ring stood a magnificent chestnut mare, her coat gleaming despite the circumstances, but her eyes clouded with the unmistakable milky film of blindness. Most of the ranchers had already turned away, muttering about the poor creature's fate. A blind horse was worthless to them, a liability that couldn't work cattle, couldn't navigate rough terrain, couldn't earn its keep. The mare stood perfectly still, her ears twitching at every sound, her nostrils flaring as she tried to make sense of her surroundings through scent and sound alone. Going twice for $1. That's when Cordell Maverick stepped forward, his weathered boots scraping against the wooden bleachers. At 62, he'd seen enough auctions to know when something didn't sit right. This mare wasn't just any horse. Her conformation spoke of champion bloodlines. Her posture revealed training that couldn't be faked, and something in her bearing suggested a spirit that blindness hadn't broken. $1, he called out, his gravelly voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. The auctioneer's relief was palpable. Sold to the gentleman in the blue shirt for $1. The hammer fell with a decisive crack that echoed through the barn. As Cordell made his way down to collect his purchase, he caught snippets of conversation from the other bidders. Fool's throwing his money away? One rancher shook his head. That horse'll be dog food by winter, another added with a snort. But Cordell had spent 4 decades training horses, and he'd learned to see beyond the obvious. When he approached, the mare, she didn't shy away or panic. Instead, she turned her head toward him, her ears pricked forward in cautious interest. He extended his hand slowly, letting her catch his scent before gently touching her neck. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "Let's get you out of here." The mare's previous owner, a red-faced man named Hobart, approached with the papers. "You sure about this, mister? She went blind about 6 months ago, some kind of infection. Been nothing but trouble since. Can't work cattle, keeps running into fences. I was fixing to put her down, but figured I'd try the auction first." Cordell studied the registration papers. The mare's name was Starlight's Promise, and her lineage traced back to some of the finest cutting horses in Texas. What was she before the blindness? "Hell, she was the best cutting horse I ever owned," Hobart admitted grudgingly. "Could read cattle like she was speaking their language. Won more competitions than I can count. But what good's a cutting horse that can't see the cattle?" As Cordell loaded the mare into his trailer, she stepped up the ramp with surprising confidence, as if she sensed that this stranger meant her no harm. The crowd began to disperse, most of them convinced they'd just witnessed an old cowboy's moment of weakness, a sentimental purchase that would cost him more than $1 before it was over. But as Cordell drove away from the auction house, the mare standing calmly in his trailer, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't pity that had driven him to bid, and it wasn't sentiment. It was the same instinct that had made him one of the most respected horse trainers in 3 counties, the ability to see potential where others saw only problems. The real test would begin tomorrow, when he introduced Starlight's Promise to his ranch. Dawn broke over the Lazy M Ranch with the kind of golden light that made even the most hardened cowboy pause to appreciate the view. Cordell had been up since 4:30, as was his habit, but today he'd spent the extra time studying. The mare he'd brought home, Starlight's Promise, stood in the paddock closest to the house, her head high, ears constantly moving, as she mapped her new world through sound. His ranch hand, Brixton, emerged from the barn carrying a bucket of oats, his expression skeptical. At 28, Brixton had worked for Cordell for 5 years and had never questioned his boss's judgment about horses. Until now. "Boss, I gotta ask, what exactly are you planning to do with her?" Brixton set the bucket down and leaned against the fence. "I mean, she's a beautiful animal, but she's blind," Cordell finished. "I know what I'm doing, Brix, trust me." The mare's ears flicked toward their voices, and she took several careful steps in their direction. Cordell watched her movement with the trained eye of someone who'd spent his life understanding horses. Her gait was tentative but not fearful. She was learning, adapting, creating a mental map of her environment with each step. "Look at how she moves," Cordell pointed out. "She's not panicking, she's processing. This mare's got more intelligence than most sighted horses I've worked with." Over the next several hours, Cordell began what he privately called his reconnaissance mission. He spent time simply being present with the mare, talking to her in low, steady tones, letting her become familiar with his voice, his scent, his presence. Every few minutes he'd move to a different position around the paddock, always announcing his movements verbally. "Moving to your left now, promise," he'd say, using the shortened version of her name. "Coming up behind you, just checking. Your back legs." What amazed him was how quickly she adapted to his verbal cues. Within hours, she was tracking his position accurately, turning her head to follow his voice, even taking a few steps toward him when he called her name. By midday, Cordell was ready for the first real test. He entered the paddock with a lead rope, approaching Promise slowly and deliberately. "Easy now, girl, we're going to take a little walk." The moment he clipped the lead rope to her halter, something remarkable happened. Promise seemed to relax, as if the connection to a human guide gave her confidence. As they began to walk around the paddock, Cordell provided a constant stream of gentle narration. "Step up here, Promise. Little rock coming up on your right. You're easy now, fence post ahead." What happened next left Cordell speechless. Promise began to anticipate obstacles before he announced them. Her ears swiveling forward, her steps becoming more confident. She was reading the subtle changes in his posture, the tension in the lead rope, the rhythm of his gait. She was learning to see through him. Brixton, who had been watching from the fence, jumped down and approached them. "Boss, that's incredible. It's like she's following your lead with her whole body." "She's a cutting horse, Brix. Her entire life was built around reading subtle cues and responding instantly. She's just transferred that skill to a human partner instead of cattle." By evening, Promise was walking confidently around the entire paddock, guided by Cordell's voice and the gentle pressure of the lead rope. But the real breakthrough came when Cordell decided to try something that most people would have considered impossible. He led Promise to the center of the paddock and dropped the lead rope entirely. Then he began to move in a slow circle around, her talking constantly, describing his position and movements. To his amazement, Promise began to pivot in place, keeping her body oriented toward him as he circled. "She's tracking me," he breathed to Brixton. "Without any physical connection, she's tracking my position perfectly." As the sun set over the Lazy M Ranch, Cordell felt a surge of excitement he hadn't experienced since his early days of training. Horses. Promise wasn't just adapting to her blindness, she was transcending it, developing abilities that her sighted days had never required. Tomorrow, he would begin the real training. 3 weeks into Promise's residency at the Lazy M Ranch, Cordell had established a routine that would have seemed impossible to most horse trainers. Every morning at dawn, he and Promise worked on what he called trust exercises, activities designed to build her confidence and their communication, while laying the groundwork for something much more ambitious. The transformation in the mare was already remarkable. Where once she had stood rigidly alert, constantly tense from the effort of navigating a world she couldn't see, Promise now moved with a fluid grace that spoke of growing confidence. Her coat had developed a lustrous sheen, and her overall demeanor had shifted from fearful to focused. "She's like a different horse," Brixton observed, watching from the fence as Cordell worked with Promise in the round pen. "Hard to believe she's the same animal we brought home from the auction." Cordell nodded without taking his eyes off Promise. Today marked the beginning of the next phase of her training, groundwork that would test the limits of what a blind horse could accomplish. He had spent the previous evening setting up a simple obstacle course in the round pen, a series of ground poles, a small jump, and several barrels arranged in a pattern that would require precise navigation. "All right, Promise," he said, approaching with the lead rope. "Today we find out what you're really made of." The first obstacle was a series of ground poles laid out in a straight line. Cordell led Promise to the beginning of the sequence, then began the process he'd refined over the past 3 weeks. Okay, girl, we've got a pole coming up. Step over. Good girl. Another pole. Step over. Perfect. What amazed him was how quickly Promise began to anticipate the rhythm. By the third pole, she was lifting her feet before he announced each obstacle, reading the subtle changes in his posture and pace that telegraphed what was coming next. But the real test came when they reached the barrels. Cordell had arranged them in a weaving pattern that would require Promise to make tight turns while maintaining forward momentum. For a sighted horse, it was a simple exercise. For a blind horse, it should have been impossible. We're going to weave around some barrels now, Promise. First one's coming up on your left. We're going to step around it to the right. As they navigated the first barrel, Cordell felt Promise's body language shift. She was concentrating intensely. Her ears locked forward, processing every bit of information he was providing. When they reached the second barrel, something clicked. Promise began to read the pattern, anticipating the turns, adjusting her stride to match the rhythm of the exercise. By the time they completed the barrel weaving sequence, both horse and trainer were breathing hard, but Promise's performance had been flawless. She had navigated the entire course without a single misstep, her trust in Cordell's guidance absolute. That's impossible, Brixton said, his voice filled with wonder. I've seen sighted horses struggle with that pattern. But Cordell was already thinking bigger. That afternoon, he made a phone call that would change everything. Delilah Crow Feather, a local trainer who specialized in cutting horses, answered on the third ring. Cordell, what can I do for you? Delilah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say no. All right, I'm listening. I've got a cutting horse here. Champion bloodlines, perfect conformation, incredible instincts. I want to enter her in the county cutting competition next month. That's wonderful, Cordell. What's the catch? Cordell took a deep breath. She's blind. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Delilah finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. Cordell, you know I respect you more than any trainer in this part of the state. But a blind cutting horse? That's not just dangerous. It's impossible. What if I told you she's been working cattle? Another long pause. Have you lost your mind? Come out to the ranch tomorrow morning. See for yourself. If you still think I'm crazy after that, I'll drop the whole idea. That evening, as Cordell did promise her dinner, he found himself talking to her about the challenge ahead. Tomorrow, girl, we find out if all this training has been building towards something real, or if I'm just a foolish old cowboy chasing an impossible dream. Promise nickered softly and nuzzled his shoulder, as if she understood exactly what he was asking of her. The next morning would bring their biggest test yet. Delilah Crowfeather arrived at the Lazy M Ranch at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, driving her dusty pickup truck with the kind of determined expression that suggested she was prepared to talk sense into an old friend who'd clearly lost his mind. She'd spent the entire drive rehearsing the gentle but firm speech she planned to give Cordell about the dangers of working with a blind cutting horse. All of that preparation evaporated the moment she saw Promise in action. Cordell had set up a small herd of cattle in the practice arena, 5 head of gentle stock that he used for training young horses. Promise stood at the edge of the arena, her posture alert but relaxed, while Cordell sat mounted on his own horse beside her. I've been working with her for 2 weeks now, Cordell explained to Delilah. Started with just getting her comfortable around cattle, letting her hear them, smell them, get used to their movement. Watch this. He guided Promise closer to the small herd, and immediately her entire demeanor changed. Her ears locked forward, her nostrils flared, and her body took on the coiled tension of a cutting horse reading cattle. But instead of relying on sight to pick out her target, Promise was using every other sense available to her. She's listening to their breathing patterns, Cordell explained quietly, feeling the vibrations of their movement through the ground. She can sense which animal is nervous, which one is trying to separate from the herd. As if to prove his point, Promise suddenly stepped forward and began to work a young steer that had been edging away from the group. Without any guidance from Cordell, She positioned herself between the steer and the rest of the herd, matching its movements with the precise timing that had made her a champion in her sighted days. The steer tried to dodge left, and Promise was there. It attempted to circle back to the herd, and Promise cut it off with perfect positioning. For nearly 3 minutes, horse and steer engaged in the ancient dance of cutting, and Promise never put a foot wrong. Delilah stood at the fence, her mouth open in amazement. That's not possible. How is she anticipating the steer's movements? Same way she always did, Cordell replied. Cutting horses don't rely primarily on sight anyway. They read body language, weight shifts, the subtle changes in an animal's balance that telegraph which direction it's going to move. Promise has just learned to enhance those other senses to compensate for her blindness. When the exercise ended, Promise stood quietly, her sides heaving slightly from exertion, but her expression calm and satisfied. It was the look of a horse that had found her purpose again. I've never seen anything like it, Delilah admitted, climbing over the fence to get a closer look at Promise. But Cordell, even if she can work cattle, the competition environment is completely different. There will be hundreds of people, strange sounds, unfamiliar surroundings. How will she handle that kind of pressure? It was a valid concern, and one that Cordell had been wrestling with for days. That's why I need your help. You know the competition circuit better than anyone. If we're going to do this, I need someone who understands what we're up against. Over. The next hour, Delilah worked with Promise herself, guiding the blind mare through increasingly complex exercises. What she discovered was a horse with abilities that transcended normal equine capabilities. Promise could sense the position of cattle through the vibrations in the ground, could read the emotional state of animals around her through scent and sound, and could execute precise movements based on the most subtle cues from her handler. She's not just compensating for her blindness, Delilah finally admitted. She's operating on a level that most sighted horses never reach. It's like losing her sight forced her to develop a sixth sense. By the end of the morning, Delilah had agreed to help prepare Promise for competition. But she had one condition. We start small. There's a local cutting contest in 2 weeks, nothing major, just a few dozen competitors. If she can handle that environment, then we'll talk about the county championship. As Delilah drove away from the ranch, she found herself thinking about the implications of what she'd witnessed. If Promise could compete successfully, it would challenge everything the horse world thought it knew about the relationship between physical ability and performance. That evening, Cordell stood in the pasture with Promise, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. What do you think, girl? Ready to show the world what you can do? Promise nickered softly and stepped closer to him, resting her head against his shoulder. In that moment, Cordell felt a connection with the mare that went beyond trainer and horse. They were partners now, bound together by trust and a shared determination to prove that limitations existed only in the mind. The countdown to competition had begun. The morning of the Pine Valley cutting contest dawned clear and cool, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made horses eager to work. As Cordell loaded Promise into the trailer, he noticed that the mare's behavior had subtly changed. She seemed more focused, more alert, as if she sensed that today was different from their practice sessions at home. She knows, Brixton observed, watching Promise's ears swivel constantly, taking in every sound. Somehow she knows this is the real thing. The Pine Valley Fairgrounds buzzed with activity as contestants arrived and began preparing for the day's events. Cordell had deliberately arrived early, wanting to give Promise time to acclimate to the new environment before the competition began. As they unloaded her from the trailer, dozens of curious onlookers gathered to watch. Word had spread through the cutting horse community about Cordell's unusual entry. Most of the competitors had come to see the spectacle for themselves. The old trainer who'd lost his mind and was planning to compete with a blind horse. The general consensus was that it would be a disaster, possibly dangerous, and certainly a waste of everyone's time. "That's her?" one competitor asked, studying Promise with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She doesn't look blind. Trust me, she is, another writer replied. My cousin was at the auction when that old fool bought her for $1, said. It was the saddest thing he'd ever seen. But as Cordell led Promise around the grounds, letting her get familiar with the layout, some of the observers began to notice things that didn't fit their preconceptions. The mare moved with confidence, her steps sure and deliberate. When they passed the practice arena where other horses were working cattle, Promise's entire body language shifted, her attention focusing with laser-like intensity on the sounds of the animals. Delilah met them at the warm-up pen, her expression a carefully controlled mask of professional calm. Inside, she was battling a storm of emotions, excitement, terror, and a growing sense that they were about to witness something unprecedented. How's she doing? Delilah asked, running her hands over Promise's neck and shoulders. She's ready, Cordell replied simply. More than ready. The warm-up session drew an even larger crowd. Delilah had brought 3 head of cattle from her own herd, animals that Promise had worked with during training. As Cordell guided the blind mare into the pen, a hush fell over the spectators. What happened next would be talked about in cutting horse circles for years to come. Promise entered the pen with the bearing of a seasoned champion. She moved toward the small herd with purpose, her ears locked forward, every muscle in her body coiled with controlled energy. When she selected her target, a black steer that had been trying to edge toward the gate, the transformation was immediate and complete. For the next 2.5 minutes, Promise demonstrated cutting horse skills that transcended anything the crowd had ever witnessed. She anticipated the steer's every move, countering its attempts to escape with positioning that was not just accurate, but seemingly supernatural. When the steer tried to fake left and break right, Promise was already there. When it attempted to use its superior size to push past her, she matched its power with perfect leverage. But it was more than just technique. Promise was clearly enjoying herself, her entire demeanor radiating the confidence and satisfaction of a horse doing exactly what she was born to do. The crowd, which had come to witness a curiosity, found themselves watching artistry. When the demonstration ended, the fairgrounds had fallen completely silent. Even the other horses seemed to sense that they'd witnessed something extraordinary. Finally, one of the veteran competitors, a grizzled rancher named Cordell, recognized from years of competition, stepped forward. Mister, I've been cutting cattle for 37 years, he said, his voice filled with respect. I've never seen anything like what that mare just did. Blind or not, she's got more cow sense than any horse I've ever worked with. The formal competition began an hour later. Promise was entered in the open division, competing against some of the finest cutting horses in the region. As Cordell rode her into the arena for their official run, the announcer's voice crackled over the PA system. Ladies and gentlemen, we have an unusual entry in today's competition. Cordell Maverick will be riding Starlight's Promise, a mare who lost her sight 6 months ago, but who has continued training. This is believed to be the first time a blind horse has ever competed in a sanctioned cutting event. The crowd was respectfully quiet as Promise entered the herd. She worked for exactly 2.5 minutes, cutting 2 different animals with a precision and style that left the judges scrambling to find adequate scores. When the run ended, the arena erupted in applause that lasted for nearly 5 minutes. The scores, when they were announced, told the story. Promise had not only avoided embarrassment, she had won the open division by a margin of 3 points, the largest victory margin in the contest's 15-year history. As Cordell accepted the trophy, tears streaming down his weathered face, Promise stood quietly beside him, her head high, her bearing proud. She had done more than win a competition. She had redefined the possible. The county championship was 6 weeks away. The weeks following Promise's victory at Pine Valley passed in a whirlwind of activity that transformed the quiet Lazy M Ranch into an unexpected hub of attention. News of the blind cutting horse's triumph had spread far beyond the local horse community, drawing visitors from across 3 states who came to witness Promise's remarkable abilities for themselves. Cordell found himself giving impromptu demonstrations nearly every day, always careful to ensure that the attention didn't overwhelm Promise or interfere with their training routine. The mare seemed to thrive on the activity, her confidence growing with each successful performance. More importantly, she was continuing to develop new skills that amazed even Cordell. "She's learning to read the other horses in the herd," he explained to a group of veterinary students who had come to study Promise's adaptive techniques. "Watch how she positions herself. She can sense which horses are nervous, which ones are dominant, and she uses that information to predict how the cattle will react." Dr. Beaumont Ridge, an equine behavioral specialist from the State University, had been studying Promise for 2 weeks. His findings were reshaping scientific understanding of equine sensory adaptation. "What we're seeing here challenges everything we thought we knew about how horses process information," he told Cordell, after a particularly impressive training session. "Promise has developed what we can only describe as enhanced proprioception, an almost supernatural awareness of spatial relationships and movement patterns. She's compensating for her lost vision by dramatically amplifying her other senses." But even as Promise's reputation grew, Cordell remained focused on their ultimate goal, the county championship. This would be a different level of competition entirely, featuring the finest cutting horses from a 5-state region, with purses large enough to attract professional trainers and riders from across the country. Delilah had been working with them daily, fine-tuning their strategy and preparing for the unique challenges of championship-level competition. "The cattle will be fresher," she explained during one training session. "More athletic, more unpredictable, and the pressure will be intense. Media, scouts from major breeding operations, competitors who've been training their entire lives for this moment." As if she understood the conversation, Promise lifted her head from grazing and nickered softly. Over the past months, she had developed an uncanny ability to sense the emotional state of the humans around her, often responding to their moods before they were fully aware of them themselves. 3 weeks before the championship, Cordell made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He entered Promise in a warm-up competition in Dallas, a major cutting event that would pit her against some of the horses she'd likely face at the county championship. "You sure about this?" Brixton asked as they loaded Promise into the trailer for the trip to Dallas. "That's a whole different level of competition." "She's ready," Cordell replied with quiet confidence. "More than that, she needs to know she can compete at the highest level before we ask her to do it when it really counts." The Dallas competition was held at a major equestrian facility, with covered arenas, professional lighting, and a crowd of nearly 3,000 spectators. As Cordell and Promise warmed up in the practice pen, he noticed something different about the mare's demeanor. She seemed more focused than ever, her attention completely absorbed by the sounds and smells of the elite competition environment. Their official run was scheduled for late in the afternoon, after most of the other Open Division competitors had performed. By the time Cordell rode Promise into the arena, word of the blind mare's presence had spread through the crowd, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The cattle were indeed fresher and more athletic than anything Promise had worked before. The first steer she selected was an athletic young animal that tested every aspect of her abilities. For nearly 3 minutes, horse and steer engaged in a battle of wills and skill that showcased cutting at its finest. Promise's performance was flawless. She read the steer's intentions with uncanny accuracy, countered its every move with perfect timing, and maintained her position with a determination that drew gasps of admiration from the crowd. When the run ended, she stood calmly in the center of the arena, her sides heaving slightly from exertion, but her bearing proud and satisfied. The scores were the highest of the day, earning Promise her second consecutive victory and establishing her as the horse to beat at the upcoming county championship. But the real breakthrough came after the competition, when Hawkins McCready, one of the most respected cutting horse trainers in the country, approached Cordell in the barn area. "I've been training cutting horses for 40 years, McCready said, extending his hand. "I've worked with horses that have sold for $500,000, animals with bloodlines that trace back to the foundation sires of the breed. But I've never seen anything like what your mare did in that arena today." He paused, studying Promise. With professional appreciation. Blindness hasn't diminished her abilities, it's enhanced them. She's operating on a level that transcends normal equine capabilities. You've got something special here, something that's going to change how we think about these horses. As they drove home from Dallas, Promise standing calmly in the trailer. Despite the day's excitement, Cordell felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond their competitive success. He had proven that limitations were often self-imposed, that with patience, understanding, and trust, the seemingly impossible could become not just possible, but extraordinary. The county championship was 2 weeks away, and Promise was ready to make history. But more than that, she was ready to inspire a new understanding of what horses, and perhaps all living beings, were truly capable of achieving when given the chance to exceed expectations. The greatest test of their partnership lay ahead, but Cordell knew that whatever happened at the championship, they had already won something far more valuable than any trophy: the knowledge that courage, determination, and trust could overcome any obstacle. Promise nickered softly from the trailer, as if she too understood that their greatest adventure was yet to come. The county championship came and went in a blur of adrenaline, excitement, and triumph. Promise not only won the open division, but did so with a performance that earned her the highest individual score in the competition's 30-year history. Her victory made national news, inspiring countless stories about overcoming adversity and redefining limits. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 6 months later, when Cordell received a call from the livestock auction house where he'd first encountered Promise. They had another horse, a young gelding who'd lost his hearing in an accident, and wondered if Cordell might be interested. As he loaded the deaf horse into his trailer, Promise standing calmly in her own paddock nearby, Cordell smiled. He had learned that sometimes the greatest treasures were hidden in the most unlikely packages, and that with patience, understanding, and love, any limitation could become a doorway to extraordinary achievement. The Lazy M Ranch had become a sanctuary for horses that others had given up on, and each animal that arrived brought new lessons about the boundless potential that exists within every living being, waiting only for someone to believe in the possible.